So you've planted some churches in the Yucatan Peninsula about 30 years ago. Tell us about that.
Well, my husband and I, we came to the Lord, and we were just lovers of Jesus, and everything that we wanted to do had to be around loving Him and loving what He loved. And we never aspired to be apostles, a prophet, a pastor. We never aspired to any of those ministries because we really didn't know about them, and we just wanted to serve God in their capacity that He called us to. So we started itinerating down in the Yucatan Peninsula, Quintana Roo, the state of Quintana Roo exactly, which is closer to the Belize border, and we tended to stick to the very rural areas of the jungle, to villages that were obscure, that no one ever visited, and they're pretty much live like they've had for hundreds of years, and thatch roofs and stick walls, dirt floors, and had their pigs and their chickens and everything running around. It's very rural, and we would go there and preach the gospel to them. And of course, these areas, they never saw white people before. They might have seen them, like maybe they've seen a TV program or a billboard or something like that, but they never officially saw a white person in the flesh. So they were kind of combination fascinated and fearful of us when we came into a village just unannounced. So we discovered that they would stay in their huts when we came in. So that's going to be a difficult thing. How are we going to get around to even talking to them? And at that time, we were traveling with our 8-year-old daughter, who was a towhead, and they'd never seen a blonde head. I was blonde headed, of course, and she was too, and they'd never seen that color hair before. And we would bring them corn and beans and rice, big bags of them, and then we would give her candy. And so we would send her out into the square. Every village had a little square. We would send her out into the square, and of course we're not alone, we're watching her. And then all the children would come out, because children aren't afraid. So the children would come out to get the candy, and she was so delightful and friendly, and they would be playing, and then the mothers would come out to see what their children would do. And then the mothers were out there with the children, and next thing we know, the fathers are like, "Where's my family?" And then the whole village would be out there. Who's this little towhead girl giving out candy to everybody? And then the beans and rice would come out. And then, of course, that was a blessing to them because it's a very impoverished area. And both my husband and I played instruments. And so we had learned a lot of Spanish songs. We actually even learned a Mayan song, because the Mayan is their mother tongue and Spanish is their second language as well. But we spoke mostly in Spanish to them, and we sang these worship songs in Spanish. And of course, they loved music. They would listen to the music. They enjoyed, of course, the stuff they got. But it got their attention, and we were able to tell them about Jesus, preach to them, and then they would raise their hands, and we'd have a good crowd, and they would all make a commitment to the Lord. And then we say, okay, now this is what you give them instructions, how to continue in the faith. And then, of course, we move on, because we were very itinerant at that time. And we move on to other places and do the same thing over and over again. So next time visit, we'd come through, and we go to the same village, and we say, okay, let's gather for church. And we, like, a handful of people show up, and we go, well, where's the rest of you? And, well, they're here and they're there. And, so we saw that it wasn't a very fruitful way of establishing churches anywhere. And that people were mainly coming because it was, they probably made some kind of commitment. We don't really know, but we know they came out for the beans and rice and the candy for sure. But we realized it wasn't the best way to do things. And the Lord reminded us, He said, I told you to go into all the world and make disciples. So we said, in order to make disciples, you have to be there and disciple people. You have to teach them. You have to mentor them. You have to instruct them. So we decided, well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to move down there. We actually, instead of just spending weeks down there traveling around to different villages, remote, we decided to find a village that the Lord picked out for us. And we stayed in a hut with them, lived with them, became friends with them, got to know them, and inviting our neighbors into our house, which is a hut. And we were having church in there, and pretty soon we're building a church there in this flourishing church. And during that time, we also met some other brethren in another town about 40 minutes away. And we began ministering there and established that church with them. And because of this, it's all based on a relationship down there. It's just really based on relationship, and because they're a very closed culture and they've been beaten down so much, they have suspicions, and rightly so, especially if you're not from there. So one of the things that we discovered that's really helpful in rural areas with their specific cultures is that the pastors that we raised up in the churches that we started, we got them to make friends with people in other villages. They just friends, no other motive, just be friends. And then they would get invited by the new friends into their hut in their village, and pretty soon they're having a church meeting in their house. And then we would come in and have a church meeting with their house. And if everything went well, and if the government of that town, these are small towns, but whoever was running that town, if you could find favor with him, you could get a church established there. If you did not find favor with him, they would shut it down with threat of bodily harm, and they have beat up families before, burned their huts down before, because they invited Christians into the village, because they're very strong Mayan religion. And at this point in time, the Mayan religion is a mixture between a Catholicism and the Talking Crosses. It's because the priests were there years ago, but they've long mixed Catholicism in with their own religion. So it's a whole new thing altogether. They have all the saints, and they do sacrifices to them with animals still. They have altars still. They do blood sacrifices on, and it's called the Talking Cross religion, because the crosses, which came from the Catholic religion, they said would talk and give them instructions in battles and things like that.
So could they read if you shared the word?
A lot of them, the older Mayan Indians did not hardly even understand Spanish, so what we would do is speak Spanish, and then our Spanish pastoral leaders that were with us would translate into Mayan. A lot of the older ones were illiterate, so we brought down, at that time, these little electronic devices that had the Mayan Bible on them. And that went over really good. That really helped with the older generation, particularly, who didn't really like or understood Spanish very well. So that was good. And then we also tried, when we didn't have the Mayan pastors with us, we would go to villages with a Jesus movie that was in Spanish. And boy, that would draw everybody out of the village to come watch the Jesus movie. And we had really good results with the Jesus movie. However, it also drew attention from the authorities. And since this area is called the Zona Maya by the government, the reason why it's called Zona Maya is now they're trying to revive the Mayan religion and the cult worship at all the pyramids that are around there. And they're encouraging that. And so if you're coming in with Christianity, that's going to kill that. So the government is actually very anti-Christian, because you're injuring their future income by them not wanting to be worshiping in the temples anymore. So when the movies drew a lot of attention, both good and bad, and that was only one thing we did. We mostly went by relationships, those sort of things.
So it sounds like this is very particular to this part of the world. Are there any generalizations you can give advice to people trying to plant churches in third world countries?
Yeah, I think you have to be very aware of the culture that you're going to, and that it's very different from the culture you're coming from, and that it's very important that you don't project your beliefs, the way you want to do things, the way you think church should be, because that was from your culture. Like, this is the way we do it in the States, this is the way you have to do your church here. And I think that brings the mighty-whitey syndrome on them, and they can't function without a white person there. That is not the goal. The goal is to make it, self-governing, self-functioning according to the New Testament template that we already have. And
so how hard is it to raise up Mayan pastors?
Actually, very easy. There are some natural-born leaders among them, and once they catch the gospel, once they understand it, and you give them a Spanish Bible and they start devouring it, they come right on board, and it's very easy to do leaders, both men and women. It's interesting in that culture that they don't have an aversion to women leaders. So a lot of there's women leaders as well as the men leaders there.
So 30 years later, is there any piece of advice you could give? And secondarily, are you happy you did it?
I am extremely happy we did it. I would do it all over again. We lived down there for 2.5 years with our 8-year-old daughter, who was actually part of our evangelical team. She just very friendly, drew crowds wherever she went, and because she was so different looking and so friendly. I would do it all over again, even though we almost got arrested a few times, almost lost our truck into a ravine. I mean, just a lot of different dangerous things. Things happened to my husband. He fell through a roof and almost lost his arm. I mean, there was a lot of challenges, but every bit of it was well worth it. And I still go down there, even though my husband has now graduated to be with the Lord, and he's perfectly happy in glory. But I continue the work. I still go down there. They called me an apostolic mother there, and I'm able to still speak into their lives and encourage them. I go down there at least once or twice a year. And they're like my second family.